I want you to imagine a war that lasts for centuries. A conflict that's officially on the books, but there are no battles, no casualties, and no one even remembers it happening. Now, this isn't some hypothetical thought experiment. These are real footnotes from our past, wars that, for all intents and purposes, existed only on paper.
You know, this was said by the Dutch ambassador back in 1986, right as he was signing a peace treaty. And his tone wasn't serious. It was filled with this dry humor. And that humor, well, it perfectly captures the absolute absurdity of what he was talking about, the 335-year war.
So what kind of conflict are we even talking about here? This was a state of war that pretty much challenged the whole definition of the word. It started way back during the English Civil War and technically lasted longer than the entire history of the United States.
Let's just put some numbers to this to really grasp it. The first one is its duration. For 335 years, the Netherlands and a tiny little group of islands off the coast of Cornwall, the Isles of Scilly, were technically at war.
Okay, so during all that time, how much fighting do you think there was? Here's the next number for you. 0. Not a single shot was ever fired. Not one cannonball, not one musket ball, nothing. And if no shots were fired, well, that leads us to the most important number of all, doesn't it? The human cost. That number was also 0, which makes this, paradoxically, the longest and most peaceful war in recorded history. Welcome to Insight History HD. Together, we will peel back the layers of narratives long locked away in the archives of history.
So how on earth does something like this even happen? How does a war go unnoticed for more than 3 centuries? Well, it all started with a simple, almost comical bit of paperwork getting overlooked. Just a single loose thread in the fabric of history that had, ultimately, harmless consequences.
All right, so let's wind the clock back. We're in the middle of the English Civil War. According to 335 Years' War, a comprehensive analysis, things moved incredibly fast. In March of 1651, a Dutch admiral named Tromp declares war on these little royalist-held islands. But then, just a couple of months later, the whole situation on the ground changes. Parliamentarian forces take the islands, the Dutch basically say, well, our problem's solved, and they just sail home. But they forgot one tiny little thing, to officially declare peace.
And that was it. That declaration of war just sat there. It's kind of like leaving a browser tab open on your computer for 300 years. A legal state of war that absolutely everyone involved completely forgot about.
And this forgotten war probably would have stayed forgotten forever if it weren't for one person getting curious, a man named Roy Duncan. A tribute from the Council of the Isles of Scilly remembers him as a very dedicated local historian. And in 1985, he decided to look into this old local legend. You know, the one about how the islands were still at war. So he actually writes a letter to the Dutch embassy in London. And you can just imagine their surprise when they looked into it and wrote back saying, you know what, you're right, it's true.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. When this story came to light, people realized something. This wasn't just a one-off historical quirk. The 335-year war was actually part of a whole strange pattern of forgotten conflicts, born from the same kind of diplomatic oversight.
Now, the Isles of Scilly is definitely the longest example, but it's not alone. There's a Spanish town, Huescar, that was at war with Denmark for 172 years after the Napoleonic Wars. Another one, Lijar, also in Spain, declared war on France for 100 years because someone in Paris had insulted their king. In every case, it was a war in name only.
So you start to see the pattern here, right? A small local dispute leads to a declaration of war. Then a much bigger international conflict happens, and the little local declaration just gets lost in the shuffle. The paperwork is forgotten, generations pass, and then, centuries later, some curious historian stumbles on it, which usually leads to a big, fun, ceremonial peace treaty.
But you do have to be careful with these stories. Not all of them turn out to be true. There's a really famous legend about the English border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed being at war with Russia for over a century. It's a fantastic tale, but it's just that, a tale.
Yeah, the Friends of Berwick and District Museum and Archives actually did the work. They went back and looked at the original Crimean War documents, and guess what? Berwick was never mentioned. The whole thing, as romantic as it sounds, was just a myth.
And this brings us back to our main story, and to a really important debate. Was the 335-year war a genuine, legally binding state of war? Was it just a harmless legend that people decided to play along with? Or was it something else entirely?
Well, there are really two ways to look at this. On one hand, the fact that the Dutch embassy confirmed it in 1985 suggests, yes, there was a real legal anomaly here. But on the other hand, as argued in the 335 Years' War, a comprehensive analysis, many historians are pretty skeptical. They say a real state of war was legally impossible, Admiral Trump wasn't the head of state, and the Isles of Scilly weren't a sovereign nation. So did either of them actually have the legal authority to declare war in the first place? It's a great question.
This leads to a much more modern and maybe a little more cynical interpretation that the whole peace treaty in 1986 wasn't so much a legal necessity as it was a brilliant PR move. I mean, what a great way to put a tiny, remote archipelago on the world map.
When you look at them, these bizarre little historical footnotes tell us something really profound about the nature of history itself.
They show us that history isn't some static, unchanging monolith that's been carved in stone.
It's actually a much more fluid narrative. It's shaped by what we choose to remember, it's rediscovered by curious people, and sometimes it's even performed with a real sense of humor. Think about it. The act of signing that peace treaty in '86 wasn't just an ending. It was a new historical event in itself, a piece of theater that gave fresh meaning to a 300-year-old document.
It proves that the line between a forgotten war and a beloved legend can be drawn by the ink of a peace treaty signed centuries later.
And that leaves us with a final question to think about. What other forgotten declarations, unresolved disputes, or just plain historical quirks are sitting right now in our own local archives, just waiting for a curious mind to find them?
If this journey has offered you a new perspective, support our exploration by subscribing to Insight History HD. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next narrative.